50 of the highest-paid marine engineers on the eastern seaboard had crawled through the belly of the Oceana, and 50 of them had walked off the docks defeated. Victoria Croft didn't want another spreadsheet of excuses. She wanted her damn engine to turn over. Enter Arthur. He wore no corporate logo, just a grease-stained shirt and the heavy, invisible collar of crushing debt. When a billionaire throws a tantrum and a desperate single father has nothing left to lose, pride goes straight out the window. Salt water and diesel fumes hung heavy in the July air, baking into the asphalt of the marina parking lot. Arthur dragged his canvas tool bag out of the bed of his rusted Ford. The zipper was broken, held together by a frayed zip tie, much like the rest of his life. He slammed the tailgate. The metallic crunch echoed across the rows of pristine, aggressively white luxury vessels bobbing in their slips. He dug a hand into his pocket, his calloused fingertips brushing against the hard plastic of Sadie's spare asthma inhaler. The pharmacy receipt was folded sharply beneath it. $300. Rent was past due. The truck needed a new alternator, and the grocery budget had been reduced to a cruel mathematical joke. Arthur didn't want to be here. He despised the marina. It smelled of unearned arrogance and rotting kelp, a place where people parked their floating vanity projects while the rest of the city suffocated under inflation. But the harbour master had called him. Big shot on slip 4, firing everybody, offering a flat 10 grand cash to anyone who can get the main drives online before her investor gala tonight. It's a suicide mission, Artie, but you looked like you needed the cash. Arthur needed the cash. He walked down the wooden pier, his steel-toed boots thudding a heavy, irregular rhythm against the planks. The Oceana loomed at the end of the dock, a sleek, matte-black monstrosity that looked less like a yacht and more like a military stealth submarine. It was aggressively modern, devoid of the warm woods and brass of traditional boats. Standing on the aft deck, pacing like a caged panther, was Victoria Croft. She didn't look like the polished magazine covers that usually plastered the newsstands. Her sharp, tailored navy pantsuit was wrinkled at the knees. Her dark hair, usually a helmet of perfection, was escaping its severe knot strands, clinging to her damp forehead. She was gripping a satellite phone so hard her knuckles were bone white. "I don't care what the Stuttgart team says." Victoria's voice cut through the ambient cry of the seagulls, harsh and ragged. "I paid $14 million for a hybrid propulsion system, not a floating paperweight. You tell them if this boat doesn't move by 8 o'clock, I am liquidating their parent company and turning their headquarters into a parking garage." She hung up, throwing the phone onto a padded white lounger. She leaned over the railing, pressing the heels of her hands into her closed eyes. She looked exhausted. Arthur felt a brief, microscopic flicker of empathy, which was instantly smothered by the memory of his negative bank balance. "Permission to come aboard?" Arthur said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that startled her. Victoria's head snapped up. Her eyes, a striking icy grey, swept over him. They catalogued his faded denim. The dark oil stains worked deep into the fabric of his shirt and the tired slump of his shoulders. Her lip curled barely a millimetre, but enough. "The delivery entrance is at the harbour master's office," she snapped, turning her back to him. "I didn't order any catering." Arthur didn't move. The sun beat down on his neck. A bead of sweat carved a track through the dust on his jaw. "Good thing I'm not carrying any hors d'oeuvres. Pete sent me. Said you have a dead block in your hybrid drive." Victoria stopped. She slowly turned back around, her expression hardening into a mask of pure, condensed irritation. "Pete sent you. The guy who runs the bait shop and the fueling dock sent me a mechanic whose tool bag looks like it was salvaged from a dumpster." She let out a short, humourless laugh. "I have had 50 top-tier engineers from 3 different continents down in that engine room for the last 4 days. They brought ground-penetrating radar and diagnostic supercomputers. They failed. What exactly are you going to do? Hit it with a wrench? If the computer's wrong, a wrench usually hurts less. Arthur replied, his tone deadpan. He shifted the 60-pound bag to his other shoulder, the nylon strap digging into his collarbone. Look, lady, you're out of options and I'm out of patience. You want the boat fixed? Or do you want to keep yelling at people over the phone while you miss your party? Victoria's eyes narrowed. The audacity of this greasy, exhausted man standing on her private dock was almost enough to short-circuit her brain. She was used to deference. She was used to terrified executives nodding furiously at her every command. She wasn't used to a man looking at her like she was nothing more than an obstacle between him and a paycheck. She stepped closer to the railing, leaning down. The faint scent of expensive bitter citrus perfume washed over him, masking the smell of the harbor. "Do you have any idea how complicated that machinery is?" she hissed. "It's a proprietary dual redundancy system. It speaks a coding language you couldn't even spell." Arthur felt his jaw tighten. He thought of Sadie sitting in the humid apartment watching cartoons while a box fan rattled uselessly in the corner. He swallowed his pride. It tasted like ash. "I don't need to speak its language," Arthur said, his voice dropping a register cold and flat. "I just need to know where it hurts." Victoria stared at him. The silence stretched, filled only by the rhythmic slapping of the tide against the fiberglass hull. She was searching for a crack in his composure, a sign of bluffing. She found nothing but a hollow, desperate exhaustion that mirrored her own. "Fine," Victoria snapped, gesturing sharply toward the boarding ramp. "If you're so good, then fix my boat. But when you fail like the rest of them, I'm not paying you a dime, and I'll have security throw you off the pier." "Deal," Arthur muttered, stepping onto the immaculate teak deck. He made sure to drag his scuffed boots just a fraction of an inch more than necessary. The air in the Oceana's engine room was thick enough to chew. It didn't smell like a traditional boat. There was no comforting scent of old diesel or marine grease. Instead, it smelled like ozone-heated silicone and the sharp, sterile tang of expensive synthetic lubricants. The acoustic paneling on the walls deadened all sound, making the space feel like a vacuum chamber. Arthur stood at the bottom of the chrome ladder, letting his eyes adjust to the harsh LED strip lighting. The propulsion system dominated the room. It was massive, a tangled labyrinth of braided steel hoses, carbon fiber cowlings, and digital readouts, blinking in angry synchronized red patterns. It looked less like an engine and more like a server farm that had been violently fused with a jet turbine. He dropped his tool bag onto the diamond plate steel floor. The metallic thud was swallowed instantly by the acoustic foam. He didn't open the bag right away. Instead, he walked slowly around the perimeter of the machinery. The previous engineers had left their mark. There were temporary wire taps, hanging loose diagrams taped to the bulkheads, and the lingering digital ghosts of 50 failed diagnostic scans. They had tried to outsmart the machine. They had spoken to it in code, trying to force the software to bypass a physical lockout. Arthur reached out and laid his bare, calloused hand flat against the main thermal housing of the portside drive. It was warm. Too warm for an engine that supposedly hadn't turned over in 4 days. He closed his eyes, tuning out the harsh lights and the blinking error codes. He pressed his ear close to the cowling. Beneath the absolute silence of the room, there was a hum, a microscopic, ragged vibration shivering through the metal. It felt erratic, like a shivering animal. "Are you whispering to it?" Arthur's eyes snapped open. Victoria was standing at the base of the ladder. She had shed the blazer of her pantsuit, the sleeves of her white silk blouse rolled up to her elbows. The humidity in the engine room was already causing a faint sheen of sweat on her collarbones. She looked out of place, a creature of boardrooms and penthouse suites, trapped in a mechanic's purgatory. "I'm listening to it," Arthur said, not pulling his hand away. "Your fancy engineers relied on the sensors, but sensors only tell you what they're programmed to see. And what does your hand tell you that $50 million in diagnostic equipment couldn't?" she asked, her voice dripping with skepticism. She crossed her arms, leaning against a steel stanchion. "It tells me the system thinks it's running," Arthur muttered, moving his hand down the curve of the housing, tracing a heavy braided cable. "The auxiliary power is feeding back into the primary ignition coil. The computer is throwing a hard lockout because it thinks the main drive is already spinning at 3,000 revolutions per minute. It's trying to prevent a catastrophic overrev." Victoria frowned, the cynical mask slipping for a fraction of a second. "That's impossible. The optical sensors on the drive shaft would verify it's stationary." "Unless," Arthur said, dropping to his knees and peering into the narrow gap between the engine block and the hull, "the harmonic balancer is misaligned. A physical shift. The optical sensor is reading a reflection off a sheared mounting bolt, interpreting the scattered light as rotational movement." He reached into his bag, pulling out a heavy, snub-nosed flashlight. He clicked it on the beam, cutting through the gloom under the block. "Get over here." Victoria blinked. "Excuse me. I need 3 hands down here. Get over here and hold the light." For a moment, Arthur thought she was going to fire him on the spot. The billionaire CEO, accustomed to snapping her fingers and having the world bend to her will, stared at him in utter disbelief. But Arthur didn't look up. He was already contorting his shoulders to slide beneath the massive cooling pipes. With a tight, furious exhale, Victoria marched over. She knelt awkwardly on the hard diamond plate, her tailored slacks pulling tight. She snatched the flashlight from his outstretched hand. "Where?" she demanded. "Shine it right past the primary alternator. See that gap?" She leaned down her shoulder, brushing against his. He smelled that bitter citrus again, cutting through the ozone. "I see a lot of wires," she said, her voice strained. "Deeper, right where the silver bracket meets the black housing." Arthur jammed his arm into the narrow space. The metal edges were sharp. He felt a jagged piece of aluminum slice across his knuckles, but he ignored the sting. Blood welled up, warm and sticky, but his fingers found what they were looking for. A heavy hex-head bolt. It was backed out just 1/4 of an inch, sitting crooked in its threads. "There!" Arthur grunted, his muscles straining as he kept his arm pinned. "The mounting bracket for the optical sensor array is loose. Every time the boat rocks in the water, the bracket shifts. The laser hits the side of this backed-out bolt instead of the timing mark. The computer panics and locks the system down." Victoria was silent for a long moment. She kept the light perfectly steady. 50 engineers. She whispered, the anger draining out of her voice, replaced by a hollow shock. 50 of the smartest people in the industry, and they missed a loose bolt. "They were looking at screens, Ms. Croft," Arthur said, slowly pulling his bleeding arm out from under the machine. He sat up, wiping the grease and blood onto his jeans. "They were looking for a complex answer, because they were paid complex money. Nobody wanted to be the guy who charged you $100,000 to tighten a screw." He reached into his bag again, pulling out a heavy, long-handled socket wrench. The steel felt cold and reassuring in his palm. He looked at Victoria. She was staring at the blood on his knuckles. For the first time since he walked onto the dock, she didn't look like a CEO. She looked human. "Hold the light steady," Arthur said quietly. "Let's fix your boat." Sweat pooled at the base of Arthur's spine, a cold, uncomfortable reminder of the engine room's stifling humidity. He wedged his shoulder harder against the carbon fiber cowling, trying to find an angle that wouldn't completely shred his rotator cuff. The gap was punishingly tight. He could feel the pulse in his neck throbbing against a hard plastic conduit. "Keep that beam dead center," Arthur grunted, his voice tight with exertion. Victoria didn't snap back. She adjusted her grip on the heavy flashlight, her knuckles white, keeping the circle of harsh LED light pinned exactly on the offending hex bolt. Arthur guided the heavy socket wrench into the gap. It was a blind maneuver. He had to rely entirely on the spatial map his fingers had drawn in his mind. The socket met the bolt head with a dull metallic click. He pulled. Nothing happened. The bolt was cross-threaded, jammed tightly into the aluminum bracket by the constant, agonizing vibration of the idling auxiliary generator. Arthur adjusted his grip, wrapping his bloody knuckles around the knurled steel of the handle. He squeezed his eyes shut, locked his jaw, and threw his entire upper body weight into the pull. For 3 agonizing seconds, it felt like the bones in his forearm were going to snap. Then, with a loud, sickening crack that echoed off the acoustic foam, the thread broke loose. Arthur's elbow slammed violently into a steel stanchion. He hissed through his teeth, a sharp, bitter string of curses spilling from his lips as pain spiderwebbed up to his shoulder. He dropped the wrench. It clattered loudly against the diamond plate floor. Victoria flinched back, the flashlight beam jerking away. "Did you break it?" she asked, her voice tight, suddenly devoid of its boardroom authority. "No," Arthur gasped, cradling his elbow against his ribs. He took a ragged breath, the smell of ozone and hot dust burning the back of his throat. "I broke it loose. It was seized." He reached blindly back into the dark recess, his fingers trembling slightly. He found the bolt and began twisting it manually, feeling the threads finally bite and lock into their proper alignment. He gave it one last brutal torque with the wrench. "Okay. It's seated. The bracket is flush." He dragged himself backward, sliding out from under the massive hybrid drive. His shirt was ruined, smeared with black molybdenum grease and sweat. He wiped his forehead with the back of a relatively clean wrist, leaving a streak of grime across his brow. Victoria stood up slowly, her knees popping. The knees of her tailored slacks were permanently stained with dark oil. She stared down at her ruined outfit for a second, a flicker of profound annoyance crossing her face before she looked back at Arthur. "So that's it. We press a button, and we go." Arthur leaned heavily against the starboard hull, waiting for his vision to stop swimming. He shook his head. "No. The system's computer has already logged a catastrophic timing failure. It locked the electronic control unit. You can tighten bolts all day, but the software still thinks the engine is actively eating itself." Victoria's jaw clenched. The cynical mask slammed right back into place. "So you didn't fix it. You just found a mechanical excuse for why the computer is broken." "I fixed the cause. Now we have to fix the symptom." Arthur said, his tone flat. He pushed himself off the hull and walked over to a massive stainless steel electrical panel mounted on the forward bulkhead. He popped the latches. Inside was a dizzying array of circuit breakers, logic boards, and heavy-gauge copper wiring. The ECU has a volatile memory cache. It holds the error code until a certified technician plugs in a proprietary tablet to clear it. "Which we don't have," Victoria pointed out, crossing her arms. "Which we don't need," Arthur corrected. "Volatile memory requires continuous power. If you drain the capacitors and cut the standby voltage simultaneously, the cache drops. The system wakes up with amnesia." He pointed a greasy finger at a heavy red lever at the top of the panel, then down to a tiny recessed metal bridge on a green circuit board. "But I can't reach the main breaker and the logic board bridge at the same time. They're spaced too far apart." Victoria stared at him. She looked at the exposed wires, then down at her hands. "You want me to reach into a high-voltage electrical panel?" "I want you to get your boat running," Arthur countered, grabbing a plastic-handled screwdriver from his bag. "I'll handle the logic board. I need you to pull that red lever down, hold it for exactly 10 seconds, and then shove it back up. Not 9 seconds. Not 11, 10. Victoria hesitated. She was a woman who commanded thousands of employees, who moved millions of dollars with a signature. She did not take orders from strangers in dirty denim, and she certainly didn't risk electrocution for manual labor. But she looked at the clock on the wall. 6:15. Her gala was starting. Investors were waiting. She stepped up to the panel, pushing her rolled-up silk sleeves higher. She reached out her manicured fingers, wrapping around the thick plastic of the red lever. "If I die down here," she muttered, "my estate will bury you in litigation for the rest of your natural life." "If you die down here, I don't get paid my 10 grand, Arthur replied, wedging the tip of his screwdriver against the metal bridge on the logic board. "I have a vested interest in your survival. On 3, 1, 2, 3, pull." Victoria yanked the lever down. The heavy thud of the breaker disconnecting plunged the engine room into a dim amber emergency glow. The low hum of the auxiliary systems instantly died. "Start counting," Arthur commanded his hand, holding the screwdriver perfectly still in the dim light. 1. Victoria said, her voice echoing strangely in the sudden dead quiet. 2. 3. As she counted, Arthur's pocket buzzed violently against his thigh. His phone, the cheap ringtone, a tinny, cheerful marimba, pierced the tension. It was Mrs. Gable, his elderly neighbor. She was watching Sadie. She only called if Sadie's breathing treatments weren't working. Arthur's heart hammered a sudden, violent rhythm against his ribs. He desperately wanted to drop the screwdriver, to pull his phone out and answer. His fingers twitched. 7. Victoria said, her eyes locked on his face. She saw the sudden panic in his eyes, the way his jaw clamped shut. 8, 9, 10. "Push it," Arthur yelled. Victoria slammed the red lever upward. Ignition didn't happen with a dramatic roar. It started as a deep, resonant vibration that originated in the floorboards and traveled straight up through the soles of Arthur's boots. The emergency amber lights flickered, died for a terrifying microsecond, and then the harsh white LED strips flared back to life. Behind them, the massive starboard drive let out a mechanized whine, followed by the heavy concussive thump-thump-thump of massive diesel cylinders firing in perfect synchronized harmony. The acoustic foam on the walls instantly soaked up the harshness of the noise, turning the engine's idle into a powerful rhythmic purr. The angry red lights on the digital readouts blinked, shifted, and settled into a calm, steady blue. Arthur dropped the screwdriver. His hands were shaking. He didn't look at the engine. He didn't look at Victoria. He frantically dug into his grease-stained pocket, pulling out his cracked smartphone. 2 missed calls, 1 text message from Mrs. Gable. "Just wanted to let you know Sadie fell asleep. Breathing is totally fine. Ate all her mac and cheese. Don't rush." Arthur closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the cool stainless steel of the breaker panel. He let out a long, ragged exhale that seemed to empty his lungs completely. The adrenaline crash hit him like a physical blow, leaving his legs feeling hollow, and his injured elbow screaming in dull, persistent agony. "It's running," Victoria said. Her voice was quiet, lacking the abrasive edge she had wielded on the deck. She walked slowly toward the massive engine block, staring at the spinning carbon fiber shafts. She reached out, hovering her hand inches from the housing, feeling the immense heat radiating outward. "It's actually running." She turned to look at Arthur. He was already kneeling on the floor, throwing his heavy wrenches back into his canvas bag without wiping them down. He zipped the bag, securing it with the frayed plastic zip tie. "Of course it's running," Arthur said, his gravelly voice exhausted. He didn't sound triumphant. He didn't sound like a man who had just bested 50 of the world's top marine engineers. He sounded like a man who had finished a 12-hour shift at a factory. He hoisted the heavy bag onto his good shoulder, wincing as the strap bit into his collarbone. You have optical alignment, a clear logic cache, and no thermal lockouts. You can take this thing to Bermuda right now if you want." He started walking toward the chrome ladder. "Wait," Victoria called out. She stepped away from the engine, wiping a smudge of grease off her cheek. It only smeared the dirt further across her flawless skin. "Where are you going?" "Home." Arthur didn't stop walking. "To my kid." "The money," she said, catching up to the base of the ladder, just as he grabbed the first rung. Arthur paused, looking down at her. "Right. Pete has my info. You can wire it to the bait shop or cut a check. Doesn't matter to me as long as it clears by Tuesday." Victoria stared up at him. For a moment, the billionaire CEO and the grease-stained mechanic just looked at each other in the sterile, perfectly climate-controlled belly of the $14 million machine. Victoria saw the dark circles under his eyes, the split skin on his knuckles the way he favored his right arm. She recognized the look. It wasn't the look of a man motivated by greed or ambition. It was the terrifying, unstoppable focus of someone who was trying to keep their head above water. "I don't wire cash to bait shops," Victoria said, her tone flattening out, regaining a fraction of its usual ice. "Come up to the main cabin. It's in the wall safe." Arthur hesitated, then stepped off the ladder. He followed her up a narrow, carpeted spiral staircase. The transition from the harsh mechanical engine room to the main salon was jarring. The air here smelled of conditioned leather, expensive teak polish, and fresh lilies arranged in a crystal vase. Floor-to-ceiling tinted windows offered a panoramic view of the marina, bathed in the orange light of the setting sun. Victoria walked past a white leather sectional sofa and pressed a panel on the mahogany wall. A section slid away, revealing a sleek biometric safe. She pressed her thumb to the scanner. The heavy door clicked open. She reached inside and pulled out a thick, banded stack of $100 bills. She didn't count it. She simply turned and held it out to him. Arthur stared at the money. It looked fake in this environment. It was just paper, but it felt as heavy as an anchor. $10,000. It meant a new alternator for the truck. It meant rent, paid 3 months in advance. It meant Sadie's inhalers, stacked neatly in the medicine cabinet without the constant gnawing fear of running out. He reached out and took the stack. The bills felt crisp and dry against his oily, blood-stained fingers. "Thank you," Arthur muttered. He shoved the money deep into his front pocket, suddenly eager to leave to get back to the gritty reality of the asphalt parking lot. "Arthur," Victoria said, as he turned toward the sliding glass doors that led to the aft deck. He stopped, looking back over his shoulder. She was standing perfectly still in the center of the luxurious salon, her ruined silk blouse and stained trousers making her look like a survivor of a shipwreck in her own living room. "Those 50 engineers," she said quietly. "They had resumes an inch thick. They went to MIT. Why couldn't they find it?" Arthur shifted his tool bag. He looked at the flawless, untouched interior of the yacht, then back to the woman who owned it. "Because they were looking at the boat the way you look at a spreadsheet," Arthur said, his voice low. "They were looking for a complex failure they could bill you for. They never bothered to actually listen to the machine." He turned back to the doors. Or maybe they just didn't need the money bad enough. He walked out onto the teak deck, the heavy glass doors sliding shut behind him, sealing Victoria Croft back inside her soundproof, perfectly functioning world. Arthur walked down the pier, his boots thudding against the wood, and didn't look back once. Heat radiated from the cracked asphalt of the marina parking lot, baking through the thin, worn soles of Arthur's boots. The sun had finally dipped below the horizon, but the July humidity clung to the city like a wet wool blanket. He reached his rusted Ford F-150, parked entirely too close to a gleaming silver Porsche. He didn't care. He threw the heavy canvas tool bag over the tailgate. It landed with a dull, muffled thud against a pile of empty cardboard boxes and a spare tire that lacked air. Arthur pulled open the driver's side door. The hinge shrieked a sound like tortured metal that made a couple loading golf clubs into an SUV 50 yards away turn and stare. He climbed into the cab. It smelled of stale coffee dust and old vinyl. He shoved the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine sputtered, coughed, and finally caught the idle rough and uneven. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had just resurrected a $14 million hybrid maritime propulsion system, but his own truck sounded like it was going to throw a rod every time he stopped at a red light. He didn't put the truck in gear right away. Instead, he reached into his front pocket and pulled out the thick stack of $100 bills. The cabin was dark, illuminated only by the sickly yellow glow of a nearby street lamp. He flipped his thumb across the edge of the paper. It was real. $10,000. He hadn't held this much physical cash in his hands since before his wife got sick, before the hospital bills swallowed their savings whole and spit them out into a cramped two-bedroom apartment over a dry cleaner. His elbow throbbed. The sharp ache radiated down to his wrist, a reminder of the seized hex bolt and the brutal force required to break it loose. He flexed his fingers. The skin over his knuckles was split, crusted with dried blood and thick black grease. He needed hydrogen peroxide and a stiff bristle brush. Putting the truck in drive, Arthur steered out of the marina. The security gate automatically lifted for him, dismissing him from the world of the ultra-wealthy. He drove toward the industrial district, the pristine waterfront giving way to pawn shops, neon liquor store signs, and chain-link fences topped with razor wire. His first stop was the 24-hour pharmacy. The fluorescent lights inside were blinding, buzzing with a high-pitched frequency that set his teeth on edge. He walked straight to the back counter, his boots squeaking on the linoleum. The pharmacist, a tired-looking kid with acne scars, eyed his ruined shirt and bloody hands with mild alarm. "Refill for Sadie," Arthur said, sliding his driver's license across the glass counter. "2 albuterol sulfate inhalers and the budesonide ampules." The kid tapped at a keyboard. "Insurance." "Cash," Arthur replied. He peeled $300 bills from the stack and set them on the counter. The paper felt heavy, loaded with a strange, dirty gravity. The transaction was quick, sterile. Arthur walked out with a small white paper bag that felt infinitely more valuable than the brick of money in his pocket. 10 minutes later, he was parallel parking outside his apartment building. The brick facade was stained with decades of city soot, and the smell of industrial solvent from the dry cleaner below permeated the stairwell. He climbed to the 3rd floor, his knees popping with every step. The exhaustion was finally catching up to him, a heavy, paralyzing weight settling over his shoulders. He unlocked the door to Unit 3B. The hinges didn't shriek, he kept them well oiled. The living room was dim lit only by the flickering blue light of a muted television. Mrs. Gable was asleep in the battered recliner, her mouth slightly open, a crossword puzzle magazine resting on her chest. Arthur closed the door softly and set his keys on the laminate counter. He walked past the living room and cracked the door to Sadie's bedroom. A small, oscillating fan whirred in the corner, doing little to combat the stagnant heat. Sadie was sprawled across her twin bed, the thin cotton sheet kicked off. She was 6 years old, small for her age, her dark hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. Arthur stood in the doorway listening. Her chest rose and fell in a steady, unbroken rhythm. No wheezing, no rattling. Just the quiet, perfect sound of normal breathing. He felt a sudden sharp tightness in his throat. He leaned against the doorframe, squeezing his eyes shut, as a wave of intense, unadulterated relief washed over him. It was a physical sensation, draining the remaining tension from his muscles, leaving him feeling hollowed out and fragile. Walking back to the kitchen, He gently tapped Mrs. Gable on the shoulder. She snorted, waking up with a start. "Oh, Arthur," she mumbled, adjusting her thick glasses. "You're back late. Did you fix the boat?" "I fixed it," Arthur said softly. He pulled 2 crisp hundreds from his pocket and pressed them into her wrinkled hand. Mrs. Gable blinked at the money. "Arthur, this is too much. We agreed on $40. "Take it, Martha. Please," he insisted, turning toward the kitchen sink. "Buy those orthopedics you were talking about." After she left, locking the deadbolt behind her, Arthur stood over the stainless steel sink. He turned on the hot water, letting it run until it steamed. He pumped cheap industrial orange soap into his palms and began to scrub. The water turned a murky, brownish black as the molybdenum grease broke down. He scrubbed until his knuckles bled anew, the sharp sting of the soap biting into the raw skin. He watched the dirt spiral down the drain, thinking about the pristine teak decks, the acoustic foam, and Victoria Croft's icy grey eyes. The money was sitting on the counter, but he couldn't wash off the feeling that he had sold a piece of his dignity to get it. 3 miles away, the Oceana sliced through the dark waters of the harbour, a sleek shadow against the glittering skyline of the city. The Investor Gala was in full swing. Soft jazz floated from hidden speakers on the aft deck, mixing with the clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the low murmured conversations of people who controlled the gross domestic product of small nations. Victoria Croft stood near the portside railing, a glass of sparkling water untouched in her hand. She had changed into a stunning, backless emerald gown, her hair swept up into an immaculate twist. The makeup artist had expertly concealed the dark circles under her eyes, and the tailored fabric hid the lingering tension in her shoulders. To the 60 guests aboard, she was the picture of unshakable corporate grace. Below her feet, the deck vibrated. It was a microscopic tremor, a perfectly tuned frequency, generated by the massive hybrid drives, churning out thousands of horsepower. The 50 corporate engineers from Stuttgart had guaranteed it would be a silent, vibrationless experience. They were wrong. Victoria could feel it. And for the first time, she found comfort in the mechanical imperfection. "Victoria, darling." She turned. Approaching her was Richard, the lead partner of the venture capital firm, underwriting her new offshore energy initiative. He wore a tuxedo that cost more than Arthur's truck, and his smile didn't reach his eyes. "A magnificent vessel," Richard said, gesturing vaguely at the illuminated water. "I have to admit, when we heard rumors of a catastrophic propulsion failure this morning, the board was concerned. But you pulled it off. The German engineering teams really are second to none, aren't they?" Victoria stared at him. She looked at his manicured nails, his perfectly styled hair, and the utter lack of calluses on his hands. She thought of the 50 men in identical polo shirts, staring at their expensive diagnostic tablets, refusing to look beneath the carbon fiber cowlings because the computer told them not to. Then she thought of the grease-stained mechanic, bleeding onto her diamond plate floor, tearing a seized bolt out of the machine by sheer force of will. "Yes," Victoria said smoothly, her voice flat. "The German team was very thorough." She took a sip of her water, turning back to the railing to end the conversation. Richard lingered for a moment, sensing the dismissal, before retreating back to the bar. Victoria looked down at her right hand. The bartender had provided warm lemon water and linen towels, but if she looked closely right at the base of her thumbnail, a faint, dark crescent of engine grease remained trapped beneath the cuticle. She rubbed it with her thumb. It felt rough, real. Her company, Croft Innovations, was bleeding money on the offshore project. They were designing autonomous maintenance submersibles, and her lead engineers were entirely paralyzed by theoretical coding errors. They were building simulations instead of building machines. They were looking at spreadsheets, just like Arthur had said. She needed someone who didn't respect the computer. She needed someone who listened to the metal. The next morning, the sun brutally exposed the peeling wallpaper in Arthur's kitchen. He sat at the small, wobbly laminate table, a cup of bitter black coffee steaming in a chipped mug before him. Spread out across the table were 4 white paper envelopes. With a black Sharpie, he had labeled them Rent 3 months Truck Alternator, Sadie Meds and Groceries. He meticulously counted the $100 bills dividing the stack. The physical act of distributing the money was therapeutic. The crushing weight that had been sitting on his chest for the past 8 months was finally lifting. He wasn't rich. The 10,000 wouldn't last forever. But it bought him time. It bought him a buffer against the terrifying edge of the cliff he had been dangling over. He took a sip of the coffee. It tasted like burnt dirt, but he didn't mind. From the living room he could hear the television. Sadie was watching a cartoon, laughing at a brightly colored dog falling down a flight of stairs. The sound was clear, her lungs open and unobstructed. Arthur leaned back in his chair, rubbing his injured elbow. The joint was stiff, the skin bruised a deep, ugly purple. He needed to get under the hood of the Ford today. He had the cash for the parts, and he couldn't stomach another day of the engine stalling at intersections. His phone buzzed on the table, vibrating against the laminate surface. Arthur frowned. It was a Saturday morning. The caller ID displayed a local number he didn't recognize. He let it ring 3 times, debating whether to ignore it. Debt collectors rarely called on weekends, but they were getting creative. With a sigh, he picked it up and hit the green icon. "Yeah," Arthur said, his voice retaining its morning gravel. "I need you back at the marina." Arthur froze. He recognized the voice instantly. The sharp, authoritative clip, the subtle undercurrent of impatience. Victoria Croft. He pulled the phone away from his ear, stared at the screen for a second, and put it back. "The job is done, Miss Croft. The system cache was cleared. The drive is aligned. I'm off the clock." "The boat is fine." Victoria's voice came through the tiny speaker, entirely devoid of the previous day's panic. "It ran flawlessly all night. That's not why I'm calling." "Then why are you calling?" Arthur asked, his eyes drifting to the envelope labeled Truck Alternator. "I don't do regular maintenance. I'm not a detailer. Call the harbour master if you want someone to polish your teak." "I don't want you to polish my deck, Arthur," she said. The line was quiet for a moment. He could hear the faint sound of wind against a microphone, telling him she was likely standing outside. "I want you to come look at a proprietary schematic for a deep-water submersible pressure valve. My lead engineers have been stuck on it for 3 weeks. They say the fluid dynamics model is impossible." Arthur let out a short, cynical laugh. "I fix boat engines, lady. I don't build submarines. You have the wrong number." "I don't think I do," Victoria countered seamlessly. "You told me my team failed because they only looked at the sensors. I need someone who listens to the machine. I'll pay you $500 an hour just to sit in the room and tell my PhDs why they're idiots." Arthur stared at his coffee mug. 500 an hour. He looked at the grease permanently embedded in the creases of his palms. He didn't belong in a room full of degrees. He belonged under a rusty chassis with a socket wrench. "I have a truck to fix," Arthur said slowly. "I'll send a car," Victoria replied immediately, unwilling to concede the point. "And a tow truck for your Ford. I have a fully equipped machine shop at the corporate headquarters. You can use the lift." Arthur closed his eyes. The contradiction gnawed at him. He despised everything her world represented. The arrogance, the detachment from reality, the casual tossing of money. But he was a father first. And pride didn't pay for albuterol. "Send the tow truck," Arthur muttered. "But I'm driving myself." Sunlight glared off the mirrored glass of Croft Innovations headquarters, a colossal architectural shard driven deep into the city's commercial district. Arthur's Ford F-150 limped down the ramp into the executive parking garage, the exhaust manifold rattling an obnoxious hollow rhythm against the pristine concrete walls. He parked between a matte black G-Wagon and a sleek, low-slung electric sedan. The engine gave one final violent shudder before dying, coughing a faint puff of blue smoke into the climate-controlled air. Arthur killed the ignition and grabbed his canvas bag. He felt completely ridiculous. The lobby was a cathedral of brushed steel and white marble. It smelled of ozone, highly oxygenated air and the sharp scent of expensive espresso. A security guard in a tailored suit eyed Arthur's scuffed boots and faded denim with blatant suspicion, but a discreet nod from the receptionist sent him toward the private executive elevator. The ride up to the 40th floor was silent and fast enough to make his stomach drop. When the polished doors slid open, Victoria Croft was waiting. She wore a sharply cut grey suit, a tablet tucked under her arm. She didn't offer a greeting, just turned and walked down the glass-walled corridor. Arthur followed the heavy thud of his boots, entirely out of sync with the hushed, carpeted silence of the floor. "They're in conference room 3, Victoria said, not looking back. "We are developing a tetherless maintenance submersible for deep-sea oil platforms. It needs to operate autonomously at 4,000 meters. The central ballast system relies on a primary pressure valve. In the simulation, the valve fails at 3,000 meters every single time. It leaks the ballast floods, and $50 million worth of equipment implodes." She pushed open a heavy frosted glass door. The conference room was massive. A long slab of white quartz served as the table surrounded by ergonomic mesh chairs. 5 men and 2 women sat around it, all wearing variations of business casual that screamed expensive dry cleaning. At the head of the table, a holographic projection of a complex cylindrical valve rotated slowly in the air, glowing in wireframe blue. Conversation stopped instantly as Arthur walked in. He dropped his canvas bag onto the quartz table. The heavy metal tools inside landed with a sharp, ugly clatter that made the man nearest to him flinch. Victoria, a tall man with wire-rimmed glasses, said, his brow furrowing. "I thought you were bringing in the consultants from MIT. Who is this?" "This is Arthur," Victoria said, coolly, taking a seat at the head of the table. "He fixed the Oceana. I'm paying him to look at the ballast valve. Walk him through the failure cascade, Davis." Davis, the man with the glasses, let out a short, incredulous breath. He looked at Arthur's calloused hands, then at the grease permanently trapped beneath his fingernails. "Ms. Croft, with all due respect, this is highly classified proprietary geometry. It requires an advanced understanding of fluid dynamics and deep-sea pressure variables. You can't just bring a mechanic in off the street to look at a stress tensor simulation." "I don't want to look at a simulation," Arthur interrupted. His gravelly voice cut through the sterile air of the room like a rusty saw blade. He ignored Davis and looked directly at Victoria. "Simulations are just math, trying to guess how the real world behaves. Math assumes perfection. The real world doesn't. Show me the metal." Davis bristled his face, flushing red. "The prototype is locked in the clean room. We don't just hand it around. The tolerances on the seal are measured in microns." Arthur leaned over the table, placing his heavy hands flat on the cool quartz. He looked at Davis with absolute, dead-eyed exhaustion. "You're telling me you've spent 3 weeks staring at a glowing blue ghost, trying to figure out why it leaks on a computer screen, and you haven't actually touched the physical part?" Silence hung heavy in the room. Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Get the prototype, Davis. Now." 10 minutes later, a heavy Pelican case was set on the table. Davis unlatched it with extreme care, pulling back the custom-cut foam to reveal a cylindrical object about the size of a coffee can. It was machined from solid titanium housing a dark, polished ceramic core. Arthur didn't use the latex gloves sitting in the case. He reached in bare-handed and lifted the valve. It was brutally heavy. The metal was cold against his palms. He ran his thumb over the mating surface where the titanium housing met the ceramic core. He closed his eyes, ignoring the indignant muttering of the engineers, and just felt the machine. "Your simulation," Arthur said quietly, keeping his eyes closed. "Does it account for ambient water temperature at 4,000 meters? "Of course," a female engineer chimed in defensively. "It's coded for a constant 35 degrees Fahrenheit." Arthur opened his eyes and set the valve down with a heavy thud. "There's your problem. You designed a static model for a dynamic environment. You used dissimilar materials." He tapped the silver housing, then the black center. "Titanium and industrial ceramic. They have completely different thermal expansion coefficients." He pulled a grease pencil from his shirt pocket and drew a crude diagram directly onto the pristine quartz tabletop. Davis gasped. "When you drop this thing into the ocean," Arthur explained, tapping the drawing, "the temperature plummets. The titanium housing constricts in the freezing water much faster than the dense ceramic core. Your micron-perfect seal is getting crushed by its own casing before the water pressure even hits it. The ceramic cracks under the inward thermal pressure, the seal warps, and the water blows right past it. Your math is fine. Your metallurgy is stupid." Arthur tossed the grease pencil onto the table. It rolled and hit the pelican case. He looked at Davis, who was staring at the crude drawing with a pale, horrified expression. "You don't have a pressure problem," Arthur muttered, picking up his tool bag. "You have a shrinking problem. Sleeve the core in a high-density polymer gasket to absorb the thermal compression, and it won't shatter." He looked at Victoria. "Can I go fix my truck now?" Sub-level 3 of the Croft Innovations building was a stark departure from the polished marble lobby. This was the fabrication lab. It was a cavernous, brilliantly lit space filled with million-dollar 5-axis CNC machines, massive 3D metal printers, and rows of pristine stainless steel workbenches. The air smelled entirely different down here, a sharp chemical mixture of synthetic cutting fluids, ozone from the TIG welders, and hot aluminum. In the center of this temple of high-tech manufacturing, Arthur's beaten-up Ford F-15 sat perched precariously on a heavy-duty hydraulic lift designed to hold military rovers. Arthur had his hood up. He was leaning over the radiator, a socket wrench in his hand, wrestling with the tensioner pulley to slide a new serpentine belt over the alternator he had just bolted in. His right elbow screamed in protest. With every pull, the deep bruise from the yacht's seized bolt, throbbing in time with his pulse. Sweat dripped from his nose onto the dirty fan shroud. "I expected you to take the money and run," a voice echoed through the massive room. Arthur didn't look up. He finally managed to slip the belt over the final groove and let the tensioner snap back into place with a satisfying metallic clack. He wiped his hands on a greasy rag pulled from his back pocket and slowly stood straight. Victoria Croft was walking across the grey epoxy floor. She had discarded the tailored jacket of her suit, her white blouse unbuttoned at the collar. She wasn't wearing heels anymore. She had swapped them for practical leather loafers. She stopped a few feet from the front bumper of his truck, looking at the exposed, rusted guts of the engine block. "I fix the problem. I build the hour." Arthur said, his voice flat. He tossed the wrench onto his canvas tool bag. "I'm just using the lift you promised. I'll be out of your hair in 10 minutes. Victoria leaned against a stainless steel workbench, crossing her arms. She watched him pack away his ratchets. Davis ran a thermal stress test on a secondary simulation using a polymer sleeve matrix exactly like you suggested. Arthur didn't pause his packing. "Let me guess. It held to 5,000 meters," Victoria said quietly. The admission seemed to cost her something, but she pushed through it. They spent 3 weeks and hundreds of thousands of dollars in computing power, and they missed basic metallurgy because they were too busy looking at code. You walked in, touched it, and solved it in 5 minutes. "I'm not a genius, Miss Croft," Arthur replied, zipping the canvas bag. "I just know how things break. When you spend your life fixing broken things, you learn that the real world doesn't care about a perfect equation. Metal shrinks, rubber rots, wires chafe. Engineers build for how things should be. Mechanics fix them for how they are." He walked over to the main control pillar and hit the release valve. The hydraulic lift hissed, lowering the heavy truck slowly back to the ground. The tires hit the epoxy floor with a dull, heavy squeak. "I'm firing Davis," Victoria stated. It wasn't a threat. It was a matter of fact. Arthur paused, his hand still on the hydraulic lever. He looked at her. "Don't do that. He's smart. He just needs to get his hands dirty. Put a desk for him in the machine shop instead of the 40th floor. Let him smell the cutting fluid while he codes." Victoria studied him. The icy, cynical exterior she wore like armor seemed slightly fractured down here in the basement. "I need someone to force them to get their hands dirty," she said. Her grey eyes locked onto his. "I am creating a new position, head of practical diagnostics. No degree required. You won't report to the engineering board. You will report directly to me. Your only job is to walk into rooms, look at their flawless billion-dollar designs, and tell them exactly why they are going to fail in the real world." Arthur stared at her. The silence in the fabrication lab was suddenly deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the ventilation system. "I'm offering you $200,000 a year, Arthur." Victoria continued, her voice steady. "Full health dental, and a premium-tier corporate medical policy that covers all dependents. No deductibles." Arthur felt his breath catch in his throat. 200,000. Premium medical. The words hit him harder than a physical blow. He thought of the 4 envelopes sitting on his wobbly kitchen table. He thought of the $300 in cash he had handed the pharmacist the night before. He thought of Sadie lying in her bed, her breathing hitched and shallow, while he panicked about how to pay for the next inhaler. He gripped the edge of the truck's fender. The metal was cool, grounding him. He hated this building. He hated the sterile lobbies, the arrogance of the executives, the sheer crushing weight of corporate bureaucracy. He had spent his life actively avoiding people like Victoria Croft. But pride didn't clear Sadie's lungs. "I dropped my daughter off at school at 8, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, tight rasp. He didn't look at Victoria. He looked down at his ruined boots. "I pick her up at 3:30. I don't work weekends unless it's a critical failure. And I don't wear a suit. Ever." Victoria didn't hesitate. She didn't negotiate. She just nodded. "I don't care if you wear a burlap sack as long as you keep my machines running." She pushed herself off the workbench and walked toward the freight elevator. She stopped halfway and looked back over her shoulder. "HR will email you the contract by 5. Be here Monday at 9. Use the executive garage." Arthur watched her step into the elevator, the heavy steel doors sliding shut behind her, sealing her back into her world. He stood alone in the cavernous, brightly lit machine shop. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his keys, the jagged metal edges biting into the soft, uncalloused skin of his palm. He climbed into his rusty Ford, turned the ignition, and listened to the engine roar to life on the first try. Heavy rain drummed against the roof of the Ford F-150, the passenger side wiper blade skipping across the glass with a high-pitched, rubbery squeak. Arthur navigated the sluggish Monday morning traffic, his right hand resting on the steering wheel, his left holding a white paper cup of bitter gas station coffee. The heat, blasting from the dashboard vents, smelled faintly of melted dust and antifreeze, a comforting, familiar mechanical musk. He pulled into the drop-off lane at Sadie's elementary school. She unbuckled her seatbelt, her bright yellow raincoat crinkling loudly in the small cab. "Have a good day at your new job, Dad," Sadie said, leaning over to kiss his rough cheek. She smelled of strawberry toothpaste and damp cotton. "Have a good day at school, Bug," Arthur replied, his voice a low rumble. He watched her hop out, her small rubber boots splashing into a puddle on the asphalt. He didn't pull away until she was safely through the double-glass doors. 40 minutes later, the Ford rumbled down the concrete ramp into the Croft Innovations executive garage. It looked like a rusted, bruised fist resting in a jewelry box of sleek German sedans and silent Italian sports cars. Arthur killed the engine, grabbed his canvas tool bag and stepped out. He was wearing clean denim today, a dark grey Henley shirt that hid oil stains well, and his scuffed steel-toed boots. He refused to buy slacks. The Human Resources office on the second floor smelled aggressively of vanilla diffusers and fresh carpet glue. A young woman with an impossibly white smile slid a small, rigid folder across her polished desk. "Your ID badge, Mr. Arthur," she chirped, oblivious to his heavy, exhausted demeanor. "And your corporate insurance cards. The premium tier is active as of midnight last night. No waiting period." Arthur picked up the plastic cards. They were thick, cold, and entirely unremarkable to look at. But as he ran his calloused thumb over the embossed letters, Dependent Sadie, the air in his lungs suddenly felt lighter. The constant suffocating pressure that had lived behind his ribs for 2 years finally evaporated. It wasn't just a piece of plastic. It was oxygen. It was safety. He slid the cards into his worn leather wallet, the sharp edges pressing reassuringly against the fabric of his pocket. He took the elevator down to sub-level 3. The doors parted, revealing the sprawling, brilliantly lit fabrication lab. The sharp scent of synthetic cutting fluids and hot aluminum instantly washed over him, drowning out the vanilla from upstairs. Arthur walked past the massive 5-axis CNC machines. In the center of the room, gathered around a heavy steel workbench, was a cluster of engineers. Davis, the lead engineer from the boardroom, was among them. He looked profoundly uncomfortable, wearing a pristine white lab coat over his expensive button-down shirt. Mounted on the workbench was a massive multi-rotor drone assembly designed for heavy-lift cargo transport. It was a beautiful piece of machinery, all matte carbon fiber and brushed titanium. And it was violently shaking. The high-pitched whine of the electric motors was deafening the metal legs of the workbench, vibrating so hard they chattered against the epoxy floor. "The harmonic resonance is entirely out of phase," Davis shouted over the noise, clutching a sleek tablet. "The gyroscopic sensors are registering a 3mm oscillation on the primary load-bearing strut. Shut it down before it tears the carbon fiber mounting plate apart." A technician slammed a red emergency stop button. The motors spooled down with a descending metallic groan. The sudden silence in the room was heavy, thick with frustration. The simulation showed a perfectly balanced load distribution. A younger engineer muttered, scrubbing a hand over his face. "The software says it shouldn't be vibrating." "The software is a liar," Arthur said. The group turned. Arthur dropped his canvas bag onto a nearby cart. The heavy metal tools inside landed with their usual unapologetic clatter. He walked up to the drone, not looking at Davis or the tablet. He reached out and grabbed the primary carbon fiber strut. He didn't pull it or shake it. He just held it, closing his eyes, letting his nerve endings map the residual heat and the microscopic settling of the metal. He opened his eyes, squatting down to look at the motor housing underneath the strut. "You're using titanium mounting bolts on a carbon fiber plate," Arthur said, his voice flat. He pointed a grease-stained finger at the joint. "Titanium is rigid. Carbon fiber flexes under torque. When the motor hits peak RPM, the plate bows a fraction of a millimeter. The rigid bolt doesn't bow with it. It creates a micro gap. The motor chatters. Davis stepped forward, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. That's impossible. We calculated the torque specifications down to the 10th of a Newton meter. You calculated it for a vacuum, Arthur replied, standing up. In the real world, torque twists. Take the titanium bolts out. Replace them with high-tensile steel alloys with a rubberized washer. Let the joint breathe. He turned and walked toward a small glass-walled office that had been hastily constructed in the corner of the fabrication lab. His name was stenciled on the door in simple black lettering. Victoria Croft was standing near the CNC machines, holding a cup of espresso. She watched the engineers scramble to find steel bolts, then looked at Arthur as he opened his office door. She didn't smile, but she gave a single, slow nod of approval. Arthur nodded back. He walked into his office, tossed his bag onto the floor, and sat down at the heavy metal desk. He was a long way from the rusted slips of the marina, trapped in the belly of a corporate machine he didn't fully understand. But as he touched his pocket, feeling the hard outline of the insurance card, he knew he was exactly where he needed to be. He leaned back in his chair, listening to the metallic clatter of the fabrication lab, ready to fix the world's most expensive mistakes. Arthur didn't change the corporate world, and Victoria didn't soften his rough edges. But they found exactly what they needed in the collision of their two realities. True genius isn't always wrapped in a degree. Sometimes it's covered in grease and driven by the fierce, unstoppable love of a parent holding the line. If Arthur's refusal to back down hit home, smash that like button and share this story with the hardest worker you know. Don't forget to subscribe for more grounded, gritty stories. Would you have taken the corporate job or walked away to keep your independence? Let us know below.